My son threw my suitcases out of his house, saying, "You don't belong here." 1 week later he found out WHO really owned the property. And his entire world collapsed. The morning my son threw my suitcases onto the front lawn, the neighborhood was strangely quiet. The only sound was the dull thud of my old leather suitcase hitting the concrete driveway. The second bag landed beside it, spilling a framed family photograph across the grass. The glass cracked instantly. I stared at the picture for a long moment. It showed a little boy sitting on my shoulders, laughing as if nothing in the world could ever hurt him. That little boy was Ethan. The same son who now stood at the front door glaring at me as though I were nothing more than an unwanted stranger. "You don't belong here anymore," he said coldly. His wife, Vanessa, crossed her arms beside him. "We've talked about this enough." I bent down slowly and picked up the broken photograph. "I helped build this house," I said quietly. Ethan laughed. "No, Dad, you worked here years ago. I own it now." His words stung far more than I expected. Maybe because part of me knew he truly believed them. He honestly thought everything surrounding him belonged to him. The walls, the land, the memories, even the future. He had no idea that every brick around him existed because of promises I had made 25 years earlier. Promises I never broke, but I also never talked about. I could have argued. I could have pulled out the documents sitting inside my briefcase. Instead, I simply closed the suitcase, looked at my son one last time, and nodded. "I hope," I said softly, "that one day you'll understand why I stayed silent." Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Oh, spare us the dramatic speeches." Ethan stepped forward and pointed toward the street. "You have 5 minutes before I call the police." Those words hurt more than anything. Not because I feared the police. Because they came from the boy whose nightmares I used to chase away. The boy whose bicycle I taught to ride. The boy I held in my arms after his mother died. For a moment I almost reminded him of those years. Then I realized, people only remember sacrifice when they're willing to see it. And Ethan wasn't ready. Not yet. I picked up my bags. Without another word, I walked away. No shouting, no threats, no revenge, just silence. Behind me the front door slammed shut. 3 houses down, old Mrs. Campbell hurried toward me. "Oh, Harold." She looked at my suitcases and immediately understood. "They actually did it." I forced a smile. "They're young." She frowned. "Being young isn't an excuse for cruelty." She offered me tea. I thanked her but declined. Instead, I walked to the small motel on the edge of town. The manager recognized me immediately. "Mr. Parker, it's been years." "It has. You need a room." "For a few nights." He didn't ask questions. People who had known me for decades rarely did. They knew I wasn't the type to complain. That evening I sat alone looking out the motel window. Rain slowly covered the parking lot. Inside my briefcase lay a thick envelope. Across the front someone had written in neat handwriting, "Property Trust Agreement." I hadn't opened it in years. There had never been a reason. Because the agreement had always been simple. As long as I lived, the property belonged to me through the family trust. No sale, no transfer, no refinancing, nothing. After my death, ownership would automatically pass to Ethan. But only if he respected one condition. He had to allow me lifetime residence. The clause wasn't my idea. It had been my late wife's. "Promise me," Emily had whispered from her hospital bed years ago, "that no matter what happens, you'll always have a home." I promised. The lawyer insisted on putting it into writing. At the time I laughed. Ethan would never throw me out. Emily didn't laugh. People change. I hated remembering that conversation. Because she had been right. Meanwhile, across town, Vanessa walked through the living room smiling. "Finally, the house is ours." Ethan poured himself a drink. "It always was." She grinned. "Now we can renovate everything. Maybe even sell it next year." He nodded confidently. "We'll make a fortune." Neither of them realized the phone call already scheduled for Monday morning would change everything. Their mortgage application had triggered a routine title review. The bank's legal department had discovered something. Something neither of them expected. A trust agreement older than their marriage. One carrying a single surviving beneficiary. Harold Parker. Me. And within 7 days, everything they believed would come crashing down. Monday morning arrived with bright sunshine. Ethan woke up feeling victorious. For the first time in years, he believed his future was finally under his control. He and Vanessa had already picked out new kitchen cabinets, luxury flooring, and plans for a backyard swimming pool. This place will be worth twice as much after we're done, Vanessa said over breakfast. Ethan smiled. I'll call the contractor this afternoon. Just then, his phone rang. The caller ID showed the bank. Good morning, Mr. Parker, a calm voice said. We're calling regarding your refinancing application. Unfortunately, we've discovered a legal issue involving the property's ownership. Ethan frowned. What legal issue? The home is currently held in the Parker Family Trust. So, our records indicate you are not the legal owner. Silence. What are you talking about? My father transferred the house to me years ago. I'm sorry, sir, but according to the county records, the trust still owns the property. Your father, Harold Parker, is the current lifetime beneficiary. Ethan laughed nervously. That has to be a mistake. It isn't. We've verified the documents twice. The call ended, but Ethan remained frozen. Vanessa stared at him. What happened? They say Dad owns the house. She burst out laughing. That's impossible. It has to be. Still, a knot formed in Ethan's stomach. For the first time since throwing his father out, he wasn't completely sure he had been right. Across town, I sat quietly in the motel lobby, reading an old newspaper when my attorney, Daniel Brooks, walked in. He looked concerned. I was wondering when I'd find you. I smiled. I had a feeling you'd hear about it. Daniel placed a thick folder on the table. The bank contacted me this morning. I figured. They've discovered the trust. I nodded without surprise. So it's finally happening. Daniel sighed. You still don't want to sue your son? No. You don't want him evicted? No. You don't even want damages? I looked out the window. I just wanted a place to live. Daniel shook his head. Harold, after everything they've done, they're still my family. Meanwhile, Ethan drove straight to the county records office. He demanded every document connected to the house. An employee returned with a thick file. There you go. He opened it. The very first page carried a familiar signature. His father's. Then another. His late mother's. Further down was the clause that made Ethan's face turn white. Harold Parker shall retain the unconditional right to live in the residence for the remainder of his life. Any attempt to remove him immediately voids all beneficiary privileges until reviewed by the trustee. Ethan read the sentence again. And again. His hands began to shake. Vanessa whispered, "What does that mean?" It means, he could barely finish the sentence. Quote. I had no legal right to throw him out. The room suddenly felt smaller. For the first time in years, Ethan remembered something he hadn't thought about since childhood. His mother lying in a hospital bed, holding his father's hand, making him promise, take care of each other. He had forgotten. His father never had. That evening, Ethan stood alone in the empty living room. The house suddenly felt different. Every wall reminded him of his father painting it after work. Every doorway reminded him of weekends spent building shelves together. Every room carried memories he had ignored. He slowly walked into the garage. In one corner stood an old wooden toolbox covered in dust. His father's toolbox. He opened it. Inside was a folded envelope with his name written across the front. For Ethan, open only if you ever doubt my love. His hands trembled as he reached for it. Ethan stood motionless in the garage. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. His own name, written in his father's familiar handwriting, stared back at him. He swallowed hard before carefully opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter, yellowed with age. My dear Ethan, if you're reading this, it means life has taken us somewhere I prayed we'd never go. I don't know what happened between us. Maybe we argued. Maybe we drifted apart. Maybe someone convinced you I was no longer the father you remembered. But before you decide who I am, I want you to know one thing. I have never stopped loving you. Every overtime shift I worked. Every birthday I celebrated with a smaller gift than I wanted. Every vacation I canceled. It was all so you could have a better future. This house was never built for me. It was built for you. Ethan's vision blurred. A tear landed on the paper. He kept reading. Your mother made me promise one thing before she passed away. Never let Ethan feel alone. I've tried to keep that promise every single day. If you're reading this because we've lost each other, then I hope someday we'll find our way back. The last line shattered him. No matter what you've done, you'll always be my son. Ethan lowered the letter. For the first time since his mother died, he cried without trying to hide it. Vanessa stood quietly in the doorway. She had never seen him like this. I didn't know, she whispered. Ethan couldn't answer. He simply folded the letter with trembling hands. Across town, Harold sat alone in the motel room. The room was clean but empty. A small suitcase rested beside the bed. The television played quietly, though he wasn't watching. His phone rang. It was Daniel. "I've received another notice," the attorney said. "The trustee wants to meet tomorrow." Harold sighed. "I expected that. They're asking whether you want to enforce the trust." Harold looked out the rain-covered window. "I don't want revenge. I know. But legally, you have every right to remove Ethan from the property." Harold closed his eyes. "I've already lost enough." The next afternoon, everyone gathered at Daniel's office. Harold arrived first. A few minutes later, Ethan and Vanessa walked in. Neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Daniel placed the trust documents on the table. "Legally," he began, "Mr. Harold Parker remains the lifetime beneficiary and controlling resident of the property." He turned another page. "The trust also states that forcing him from the home is a direct violation of its conditions." Ethan lowered his head. "I understand." Daniel looked at Harold. "You have several legal options." Harold didn't even glance at the paperwork. Instead, he looked at his son. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Ethan's voice broke. "I'm sorry." Harold remained silent. "I believed things about you that weren't true." Another pause. I thought the house was mine." Harold nodded gently. "I know." Ethan wiped away tears. "I threw away the one person who never threw me away." The room fell silent. Vanessa quietly began crying too. She finally realized this had never been about money. It had always been about family. Harold slowly stood. He walked over to his son. For a second, Ethan couldn't even look him in the eyes. Then Harold placed a hand on his shoulder. "I forgave you before you apologized." Ethan looked up in disbelief. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences." Harold's voice remained calm. "You'll have to earn back trust." Ethan nodded immediately. "I will. I'll do whatever it takes." Harold gave a small, tired smile. "Then let's start by going home." Ethan's eyes filled with tears again. For the first time in a week, he realized that home had never been the house. It had always been the father waiting to forgive him. The drive home was silent. Harold sat in the passenger seat while Ethan drove with both hands gripping the steering wheel. Neither of them knew how to erase the pain of the past week. When they arrived, Ethan parked in the driveway but didn't get out immediately. "I'm ashamed to ask you to walk back through that front door," he said quietly. Harold looked at the house, the same house he had spent years building with his own hands. "I've walked through that door thousands of times," he replied softly. "I'm not afraid of a house. I was only afraid of losing my son." Ethan lowered his head. Inside, Vanessa had already cleaned the living room. She had placed Harold's favorite armchair back in its old corner by the window. The family photographs she had taken down were back on the walls. One frame caught Ethan's attention. It showed him at 10 years old, proudly holding a small birdhouse. "I remember this," he whispered. Harold smiled faintly. "You built it. I thought you made it. I only held the wood while you learned." Ethan stared at the picture. "So many things I never noticed." That evening, Harold unlocked a small wooden chest he had kept hidden in the attic for years. Inside were old notebooks, receipts, faded photographs, and carefully folded letters. He handed one notebook to Ethan. "Read the first page." Ethan opened it. The date at the top was April 14th, 26 years earlier. The first sentence read, "Today I signed a second job because Emily's treatment costs more than I earn. I'll work nights if that's what it takes. Ethan deserves a future, even if I grow too tired to enjoy mine." Ethan turned another page. Every month contained another entry. Some described 16-hour workdays. Others talked about missing birthdays because Harold was repairing roofs or unloading trucks. One page stopped Ethan cold. "Couldn't afford a winter coat for myself this year. Bought Ethan the blue one he wanted instead. He smiled all afternoon. Worth every penny." Tears rolled down Ethan's face. He whispered, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Harold answered with a gentle smile. "A parent's sacrifices aren't meant to become a child's burden." Later that night, Ethan sat alone on the back porch. The guilt was overwhelming. He remembered every harsh word, every ignored phone call, every holiday he had skipped because Vanessa insisted they were too busy. He realized something painful. His father had spent years protecting him from hardship. He had repaid that kindness with rejection. Vanessa stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I owe him an apology too," she said. Ethan nodded. "We both do." She looked toward the garden. "I let pride convince me your father was standing in our way." Ethan sighed. "No, He was the reason we had anything to begin with. For the first time since their marriage, they both understood that wealth wasn't measured by property deeds or bank accounts. It was measured by the people who stood beside you when life became difficult. And Harold had stood beside them all along. The next morning, Harold woke before sunrise. For years, it had been his habit to make coffee before anyone else was awake. Even after everything that had happened, his routine hadn't changed. As the aroma filled the kitchen, Ethan quietly walked in. "Dad," Harold turned and smiled. "Good morning." Ethan hesitated before speaking. "I know saying, 'I'm sorry,' isn't enough." Harold handed him a cup of coffee. "No, but it's a good place to start." The two men sat at the kitchen table in silence. It wasn't awkward, it was the kind of silence that only family can share. Later that afternoon, Harold carried a small wooden box from his bedroom. "I've been keeping this for 20 years, he said. "It belonged to your mother." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "My mom," Harold nodded. "She asked me not to give it to you until I believed you were ready." Inside the box were photographs, birthday cards, and a sealed envelope. Across the front, in Emily's handwriting, were the words, "For my son, Ethan. Open when you finally understand what family means." With trembling hands, Ethan opened the letter. "My sweet Ethan, if you're reading this, then your father believes you've grown enough to understand something I couldn't explain while I was alive. Your father isn't a perfect man. He makes mistakes. He worries too much. He works too hard. But if there is one thing you should never doubt, it is this. He loves you more than he loves himself." Ethan paused, unable to hold back his tears. He continued reading. "If one day you become angry with him, remember this. Before judging the man he became, remember the sacrifices that shaped him. He would gladly lose everything if it meant you had a better life. Please don't ever mistake his silence for a lack of love." The final sentence broke everyone in the room. "Take care of your father, because one day you'll realize he spent his whole life taking care of you." Ethan lowered the letter. He couldn't speak. He simply stood up and hugged Harold tighter than he had since he was a little boy. For the first time in many years, neither of them felt alone. That evening, there was another knock at the door. Harold opened it. Standing outside was Daniel Brooks. "I thought you'd like to know," the attorney said with a smile. "The trustee reviewed everything today." Harold looked surprised. "And the trust remains exactly as it is." Daniel smiled warmly. "But there's one more thing." He handed Harold another sealed envelope. "It was filed alongside the trust all those years ago." Harold frowned. "I've never seen this." "The instructions were clear," Daniel replied. "Only deliver this if Harold and Ethan are together again as father and son." Harold slowly opened the envelope. Inside was one final handwritten note from Emily. The moment he saw the first line, his eyes filled with tears. He whispered, "Emily, you." Harold held the letter carefully, as if it might fall apart in his hands. For a long moment, no one spoke. Ethan and Vanessa watched quietly as Harold unfolded the paper. Emily's elegant handwriting filled the page. Harold began reading aloud. "My dearest Harold and my precious Ethan. If you're reading this together, then my greatest prayer has finally been answered. I always believed there would come a day when life would test your love for each other. I only hope that love proved stronger than pride." Harold paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "Harold, if you've forgiven Ethan, thank you. And Ethan, if you've asked your father for forgiveness, then you've already taken the hardest step a person can take." Tears rolled down Vanessa's cheeks as Harold read the final paragraph. "This house was never meant to be the greatest gift I left behind. My greatest gift was the hope that one day, the two men I love most would always choose each other over money, anger, or pride. If you've done that, then I've already received everything I ever wished for." The room fell silent. No one could hold back their tears. That evening, Ethan walked into the backyard alone. He looked at the old oak tree where his father had built him a swing when he was 6 years old. The swing was still there. Weathered, faded, but strong, just like the man who had built it. Harold quietly joined him. "You remember?" he asked. Ethan smiled through his tears. "I used to think you could fix anything." Harold chuckled softly. "I couldn't fix everything. You fixed what mattered." Ethan looked at his father. "I spent years chasing success. I forgot the person who made it possible." Harold placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can't change yesterday, but we can decide what tomorrow looks like." Ethan nodded. "And tomorrow, I'm going to spend it being the son you deserved all along." Harold smiled. "That's all I've ever wanted." Over the next few weeks, The house changed, not because of expensive renovations, but because the family changed. Dinner was shared together every evening. Old photographs were restored and placed back on the walls. Laughter slowly replaced silence. One Saturday morning, Ethan surprised Harold by rebuilding the old front porch they had once planned to repair together. This time, Ethan said with a grin, "We're building it side by side." Harold picked up his hammer. Just like old times. As the sun set behind the house, Harold looked at his son with quiet pride. The house had never truly been about ownership. It had always been about the family inside it. And for the first time in many years, it finally felt like home again. 1 year passed. The wounds had healed, but the lessons remained. Harold no longer stayed in the guest room. Ethan insisted that his father move back into the master bedroom, the room Harold and Emily had once shared. "It was always your room," Ethan said. "I was just living in it." Harold smiled, but his eyes grew moist. "Thank you, son." Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Every Sunday, the family ate breakfast together on the back porch. Neighbors who had once whispered about the terrible argument now smiled whenever they saw Harold and Ethan working side by side in the garden. Mrs. Campbell often joked, "Looks like this house finally has its heart back." Everyone laughed. One afternoon, Ethan received an unexpected call from the same bank that had once informed him he wasn't the legal owner. "Mr. Parker," the manager said, "we'd like to meet regarding the Parker Family Trust." This time, Ethan smiled. "I'll bring my father with me." At the meeting, the bank manager greeted Harold with respect. "Mr. Parker, we've reviewed your trust. Everything remains in order." Then he turned to Ethan. "We also want you to know something." He slid a folder across the table. "Your father has refused several offers over the years to sell this property." Ethan looked surprised. "Several offers?" The manager nodded. "Developers offered millions because this land has become extremely valuable." Ethan slowly looked at Harold. "You never told me." Harold shrugged. "I didn't build this house to become rich. I built it so my family would always have a home." Ethan lowered his eyes. Even now, his father was thinking about family before money. On the drive home, Ethan finally asked the question that had haunted him for months. "Dad, after everything I did, why did you forgive me so easily?" Harold looked out the window for a long moment. "When you were 5 years old," he began, "you accidentally broke your mother's favorite vase. I remember. You cried all night because you thought we'd stop loving you." Ethan nodded. "Your mother picked you up and said something I'll never forget." Harold smiled. "A child doesn't stop being our child because of one terrible mistake." He looked at Ethan. "I've carried those words with me ever since." Ethan couldn't hold back his tears. "I don't deserve you." Harold gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "No parent waits for their child to deserve love. We simply love them." That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table. Harold raised his glass. "To Emily." Everyone smiled. "To Emily." Then Harold added, "And to second chances." Ethan reached across the table and held his father's hand. "I promise you something." Harold looked at him. "No matter what happens in the future, you will never again wonder whether you belong here." Harold smiled warmly. "I already know." Outside, the porch light glowed softly as the evening breeze moved through the old oak tree. The same house that had once witnessed heartbreak now echoed with laughter, forgiveness, and love. And this time, it wasn't the property that held the family together. It was the people who had finally remembered what home truly meant. 6 months after life finally returned to normal, the Parker family believed the hardest chapter of their lives was behind them. They were wrong. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a black luxury SUV pulled into the driveway. A sharply dressed man stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. Harold was trimming the rose bushes when the stranger approached. "Mr. Harold Parker." Harold nodded. "That's me." The man extended his hand. "My name is Richard Collins. I'm an attorney representing Horizon Development Group." Harold recognized the name immediately. It was the same company that had tried to buy the property years ago. "I'm not interested in selling," Harold said politely. Richard smiled. "I know. That's why I'm here." Harold frowned. "What do you mean?" Richard opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. "Our company has increased its offer." Harold shook his head. "My answer hasn't changed." Richard looked him straight in the eyes. "Mr. Parker, we're offering $12 million. Harold remained silent. Just then, Ethan stepped onto the porch, having overheard the conversation. $12 million, he whispered in disbelief. Richard continued, "The city has approved a commercial redevelopment project. Your property is the final piece we need. He placed the contract on the porch table. You have 30 days to decide. With that, he handed Harold his business card and left. That evening, the family sat around the dining table in complete silence. $12 million. It was more money than Ethan had ever imagined. Finally, Vanessa spoke. A year ago, I would have begged you to sell. She looked at Harold. But not anymore. Ethan nodded. This house isn't just land. It's Mom. It's our memories. It's everything you sacrificed. Harold smiled quietly. I'm proud of both of you. The next morning, Harold walked into the attic and opened the old wooden chest one more time. Hidden beneath Emily's letters was a rolled-up blueprint. Ethan carefully unrolled it. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Emily. If our family ever has the chance to choose between money and memories, I hope they'll remember that a house can be replaced, but a home cannot. Ethan folded the blueprint carefully. We're not selling. Harold smiled. I had a feeling you'd say that. 3 days later, Richard Collins returned. Have you reached a decision? He asked. Harold looked at Ethan, then at Vanessa. Finally, he smiled. Yes. Richard opened his briefcase, expecting signed papers. Instead, Harold slid the unsigned contract back across the table. I'm keeping my home. Richard looked stunned. You're turning down $12 million. Harold nodded calmly. Money can build another house. It can't rebuild a lifetime of memories. Richard closed his briefcase slowly. I've negotiated thousands of property deals. He smiled respectfully. This is the first time I've seen someone choose family over fortune. As the SUV disappeared down the road, Ethan wrapped an arm around his father's shoulders. I used to think owning this house made someone rich. Harold smiled. And now, Ethan looked at the old porch, the oak tree, and the family photos visible through the living room window. Now I know, the richest man here has always been you. Harold's eyes filled with quiet tears. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel like the owner of a house. He felt like the keeper of a family's. A week after Harold turned down the $12 million offer, life seemed peaceful again. Then another letter arrived. It wasn't from a developer. It was from Harold's attorney, Daniel Brooks. The envelope was marked, urgent, please visit my office. Harold frowned. I wonder what this is about. Ethan looked concerned. I'll drive you. The next morning, they arrived at Daniel's office. Daniel greeted them warmly but looked unusually serious. Please, have a seat. Harold noticed several old files spread across the conference table. Is something wrong? Daniel took a deep breath. Not wrong, just unexpected. He slid a thick folder toward Harold. I was reviewing the Parker Family Trust after the recent purchase offer. During that review, I found another sealed document that had never been opened. Harold looked puzzled. Another one. Daniel nodded. It was filed by Emily on the same day the trust was created. Ethan's heart began to race. My mom. Daniel carefully broke the seal and unfolded the papers. This document is Emily's final amendment to the trust. Harold stared in disbelief. I never knew she added anything. Daniel adjusted his glasses and began to read. If, at any point, Harold and Ethan are fully reconciled and willingly choose each other over money, anger, or pride, then the trust shall continue exactly as planned. Daniel paused and smiled. But there's more. He turned the page. If that day comes, I ask Harold to do one final thing, not because he must, but because I know his heart. Harold's hands trembled. What did she ask? Daniel looked directly at him. Emily asked that, when you believe Ethan has truly changed, you give him responsibility, not as a reward, but as a chance to become the kind of father she always hoped he would be. The room fell silent. Ethan couldn't speak. Harold slowly folded the papers. For years, he whispered, I thought the trust was about protecting a house. He looked at the photograph of Emily that Daniel kept on the table from the file. It was never about the house. It was about protecting our family until we were ready to protect each other. Daniel smiled. I think Emily knew exactly what she was doing. On the drive home, Ethan finally broke the silence. Dad, Harold turned toward him, if you decide never to transfer the house to me, I'll understand. I've already received something far more valuable. Harold smiled gently. And what's that? Ethan's eyes filled with tears. My father. Harold reached across the center console and squeezed his son's shoulder. You finally understood. That evening, as the sun set behind the old oak tree, Harold stood on the porch with Emily's photograph in his hands. He looked toward the sky and whispered, You were right, Emily. It just took him a little longer than we hoped. A soft breeze rustled the leaves. Harold smiled. For the first time in years, his heart felt completely at peace. The following Sunday, Harold invited Ethan and Vanessa to join him in the backyard. The old oak tree cast a wide shadow across the lawn, just as it had for decades. Beneath it stood a small wooden table with 3 folders neatly arranged. Ethan looked puzzled. "Dad, what's all this?" Harold smiled. "Sit down." When they were seated, Harold opened the first folder. "It's time you both knew something I've never shared." He pulled out dozens of faded receipts, construction permits, and old photographs. "This house wasn't built by a construction company." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Harold pointed to one of the photographs. It showed a much younger Harold pouring concrete with a handful of friends. "I laid the foundation myself." Another picture showed Harold carrying bricks long after sunset. "I worked every weekend for almost 4 years." Then he held up one final photograph. Emily stood beside the unfinished house, smiling despite the scarf covering her head during chemotherapy. "She insisted on placing the very first brick," Harold said softly. "She wanted her love to be part of these walls forever." Vanessa wiped away tears. "I never knew." Harold smiled sadly. "Very few people did." He then opened the second folder. Inside was a new estate plan. Ethan looked at it but didn't touch it. "Dad," Harold nodded, "I've updated the trust." Ethan immediately shook his head. "I don't want the house because I expect it." Harold smiled proudly. "I know. That's exactly why you're finally ready." He explained that the property would one day pass to Ethan, but with one condition. "If I ever have grandchildren living here," Harold said, "this house must always remain a place where every generation is welcome. No one can ever be thrown out the way I was." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I promise. I'll honor that for the rest of my life." Just then, there was another surprise. Vanessa reached into her purse and handed Harold a small gift box. "We've been waiting for the right moment." Harold opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny pair of baby shoes. He looked up in confusion. Vanessa smiled through happy tears. "You're going to be a grandfather." Harold froze. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then Ethan laughed. "You always said this house needed more laughter." Harold stood, his eyes overflowing with tears, and embraced them both. "This is the greatest gift I've ever received." 9 months later, the sound of a baby's laughter filled the Parker home. Harold gently rocked his newborn granddaughter to sleep in the same wooden rocking chair Emily had once used. He looked at the family gathered around him, Ethan, Vanessa, and the newest member of the Parker family. The house felt alive again. Not because of its value. Not because of the land. But because every room was once again filled with love. As Harold looked at Emily's framed photograph above the fireplace, he smiled and whispered, "We did it, Emily. Our family finally found its way home." 3 years passed. The Parker home was filled with life again. Little Lily, Harold's granddaughter, had become the heart of the family. Every afternoon she ran into Harold's arms the moment he stepped into the garden. "Grandpa," she would shout. Harold always answered with the same smile. "There's my little sunshine." For the first time in decades, the house echoed with children's laughter instead of silence. One autumn morning, however, peace was interrupted by a phone call. Harold's younger brother, Thomas, had passed away after a long illness. Although the brothers had rarely spoken during the last 15 years because of old family disagreements, Harold never stopped caring about him. The family traveled to the funeral together. Rain fell gently as mourners gathered outside the small country church. Harold stood quietly near the back, paying his respects. Then he noticed a man in an expensive black suit watching him from across the cemetery. The stranger looked to be in his early 50s. He didn't approach anyone else. He kept staring at Harold. After the service ended, the man finally walked over. "Mr. Harold Parker." Harold nodded. "Yes." The man extended his hand. "My name is Michael Carter. I've been looking for you for almost 20 years. Harold frowned. "I'm sorry, have we met?" Michael shook his head. "No, but your brother asked me to find you if anything ever happened to him." He reached into his briefcase and handed Harold a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Thomas's handwriting, were the words, "To my brother Harold, please forgive me." Harold's hands trembled. He hadn't received a letter from Thomas in over a decade. That evening, back at the Parker home, the family gathered around the dining table. Harold slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. He began reading aloud. "Dear Harold, if you're reading this, I'm no longer here. I've carried a burden for years that I was too ashamed to confess. The truth is, I blamed you for things that were never your fault. I allowed pride to destroy our relationship, and I lost precious years with my only brother. Watching you forgive Ethan reminded me of something I never had the courage to do. Ask for your forgiveness. Harold stopped reading for a moment. His voice shook. He continued, before I leave this world, I need you to know one thing. You were always the better man. Not because you never made mistakes, but because you never stopped loving the people who hurt you. Tears rolled down Harold's face. Ethan quietly placed a hand on his father's shoulder. The final paragraph read, please don't let my mistakes become another generation's burden. Tell Lily about her great uncle someday. Tell her that pride can destroy a family, but forgiveness can rebuild one. Harold folded the letter carefully. For a long time, no one spoke. Finally, Harold looked at Ethan and smiled sadly. It seems your uncle taught us one final lesson. Ethan nodded. What's that? Harold looked toward Emily's photograph above the fireplace. Life is too short to wait for tomorrow before saying, I'm sorry. Outside, the porch light glowed warmly as little Lily ran into the living room, laughing without a care in the world. Harold picked her up, holding her close. He silently promised himself that the next generation of the Parker family would inherit love instead of regret. A few weeks after Thomas's funeral, life settled into its familiar rhythm. Every evening, little Lily waited by the front window for her grandfather to come home from his walk. The moment she saw him, she ran to the door. Grandpa. Harold laughed as he lifted her into his arms. There's my favorite little girl. Ethan watched from the porch, smiling. Not long ago, he had nearly lost this man forever. Now he treasured every moment they shared. One Saturday morning, Harold called the family into the living room. On the coffee table sat a small wooden box, the same one that had held Emily's letters years before. I have one last thing to show you, Harold said. Inside the box was a simple leather-bound journal. The cover read, The Parker Family Legacy. Harold opened the first page. I started writing this the day your mother passed away, he told Ethan. I wanted Lily, and every generation after her, to know where this family came from. Ethan gently turned the pages. There were stories about Emily's courage during her illness, photographs of the house being built brick by brick, handwritten recipes, birthday memories, and lessons Harold had learned through a lifetime of hardship. One page was titled, 5 Rules for the Parker Family. Harold read them aloud. 1. Never let pride speak louder than love. 2. Forgive before it's too late. 3. A home is measured by kindness, not money. 4. Protect your family, especially when they're hardest to love. 5. Always leave the door open for someone who truly wants to come home. The room fell silent. Even Vanessa, who had once encouraged Harold to leave, couldn't hold back her tears. That evening, there was another knock at the door. Harold opened it. Standing outside was a young woman in her late 20s. She looked nervous. Mr. Parker. Yes, my name is Grace Carter. Harold recognized the last name immediately. Carter. She nodded. I'm Michael Carter's daughter. Harold invited her inside. She placed an old photo album on the table. My father passed away last month. Everyone fell silent. Before he died, he asked me to bring this to you. Harold carefully opened the album. Inside were dozens of photographs of him and his brother Thomas as children, fishing together, playing baseball, laughing in front of their parents' old farmhouse. Photos Harold thought had been lost forever. Tucked inside the final page was a handwritten note from Michael. Harold, your brother never stopped talking about you. His greatest regret wasn't losing money. It wasn't losing land. It was losing time with his family. Please keep these memories alive. They're worth more than anything else I can leave behind. Harold closed the album with trembling hands. He looked around the room, at Ethan, Vanessa, little Lily, and the photographs spread across the table. Then he smiled. We've spent years protecting this house. He rested his hand on the family album. But this is the real inheritance. Little Lily climbed onto his lap and pointed at one of the old pictures. Who's that, Grandpa? Harold smiled warmly. That's your great-uncle Thomas. Were you best friends? Harold looked at the photo for a long moment. Then he answered softly, we forgot how to be. He hugged Lily a little tighter. But I'm going to make sure you never forget. As the family gathered around the album, Harold realized something beautiful. The Parker family's greatest legacy wasn't the house. It wasn't the trust. It wasn't the land. It was the choice, made again and again, to forgive, to love, and to stay together.